Imagine you are falling from the sky, strapped to a rocket seat. You have just abandoned your fighter jet because it was spinning out of control, a death trap screaming towards the earth. You brace for the jolt of the parachute, grateful to be alive, and you look down one last time to see your aircraft crash and burn. But instead of an explosion, you see the impossible. Your jet, now empty, stops spinning. It levels out, it ignites its engine, and it flies away without you, landing perfectly in a farmer's field as if it never needed a pilot at all. This isn't a scene from a science fiction movie. This is the true, bizarre story of the Cornfield Bomber. Welcome to Hidden Valor. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this video from? To understand how a 30,000-pound supersonic interceptor can land itself, we first have to understand the world it came from. The year was 1970. The Cold War was freezing cold. Across the vast, empty plains of the northern United States, the Air Force maintained a vigilant watch against the threat of Soviet nuclear bombers. The tool of choice for this job was the Convair F-106 Delta Dart. They called it the ultimate interceptor. It was a beautiful machine, sleek and sharp, looking more like a paper dart than a weapon of war. It was built for one thing: speed. It could fly at twice the speed of sound, reaching altitudes that brushed the edge of space. It carried nuclear-tipped rockets designed to wipe out formations of enemy bombers. But for all its power and technological sophistication, the F-106 was a beast to handle. It was part of the famous Century Series fighters, a generation of jets built when engineers were still figuring out the rules of supersonic flight. These planes were fast, but they were unforgiving. At Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, the 71st Fighter Interceptor Squadron was busy training for the unthinkable. Among the pilots was First Lieutenant Gary Faust. Faust was a skilled aviator, trained to handle the complex systems of the Delta Dart. On the morning of February 2, 1970, he walked out to the tarmac for what was supposed to be a routine training mission. The air in Montana was biting cold, the sky a crisp, endless blue. It was a perfect day for flying. He climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The F-106 was tight, a cocoon of switches, dials, and analog gauges. He strapped in, connecting his oxygen mask and checking his ejection seat pins. The canopy came down, sealing him off from the world. As the engine roared to life, shaking the airframe with thousands of pounds of thrust, Faust had no idea that he was about to become the protagonist of one of the strangest aviation legends in history. He took off, his wingman close behind. They climbed rapidly, leaving the snowy plains of Montana far below. The mission for the day involved air combat maneuvers, or dogfighting. This was serious business. While the F-106 was designed to shoot down lumbering bombers, pilots needed to know how to handle themselves if they got tangled up with enemy fighters. They needed to push the jet to its limits, to feel the edge of the envelope where the plane stopped flying and started falling. At roughly 35,000 feet, the engagement began. Faust and his instructor entered a turning fight, a high-speed dance where each pilot tries to get behind the other. Faust pulled hard on the stick, banking the Delta Dart aggressively. The G-forces pressed him into a seat, his anti-G suit inflating to keep the blood in his brain. He was focused, his eyes scanning the sky, his hands working the controls with practiced precision. But the F-106 had a dark side. Its large delta wing, shaped like a triangle, was great for high-speed dashes, but at low speeds and high angles of attack, it could be treacherous. As Faust turned, bleeding off speed to tighten his... In a split second, the plane snapped. It stalled. But it didn't just stall, it entered a post-stall gyration. The nose whipped around, and the aircraft began to fall out of the sky. Faust fought the controls, slamming the stick forward to break the stall, but the jet wasn't responding. It had entered a flat spin. A flat spin is a pilot's worst nightmare. Imagine a frisbee spinning as it falls flat toward the ground. That is what the F-106 was doing. It wasn't diving, it was rotating horizontally, belly down, falling like a leaf. The world outside the cockpit became a blur of blue sky and white snow, spinning around and around. The centrifugal force pinned Faust against the side of the cockpit. His eyes locked on the altimeter. It was unwinding fast. 30,000 feet, 25,000 feet. Faust tried everything. He ran through the emergency checklist, he throttled up, he throttled down, he deployed the drag chute, a small parachute in the tail designed to slow the plane on landing, hoping it would pop the nose down and break the spin. It didn't work. The chute just flapped uselessly in the chaotic airflow behind the tumbling jet. The F-106 was dead weight, falling at thousands of feet per minute. Inside the helmet, the sound of Faust's breathing was ragged. He was wrestling a 20-ton machine that wanted to kill him. His instructor, watching from the other plane, called out instructions over the radio, his voice tight with urgency. But nothing worked. The ground was rushing up to meet him. The spinning horizon was dizzying. The mountains of Montana were getting bigger, their jagged peaks waiting to catch him. At 15,000 feet, the situation was critical. Faust had battled the spin for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was only seconds. He knew the protocol. If you can't recover by a certain altitude, you get out. You don't ride a dead plane into the ground. Faust made the call. He gripped the ejection handles on the side of his seat. It is a decision that goes against every instinct a pilot has. This machine is your responsibility. It is your weapon, your shield, your home in the sky. To abandon it feels like a betrayal. But survival is the ultimate order. He squeezed the triggers. The canopy blew away with a deafening roar. An instant later, the rocket motor under his seat ignited. Faust was blasted out of the cockpit, the force slamming his spine as he was thrown into the freezing slipstream. The sudden silence was shocking. The roar of the engine and the wind was replaced by the muffled quiet of the high atmosphere. His parachute deployed, jerking him upward, and he swung gently beneath the silk canopy. He was alive. He checked his limbs. Everything seemed to work. He looked down, expecting to see a fireball on the snow-covered prairie below. He expected to see the twisted wreckage of the jet that had just tried to kill him. But that is not what he saw. Below him, the F-106 was still there, but it wasn't crashing. When Faust ejected, the sudden shift in weight changed everything. The pilot and the heavy ejection seat were gone, shifting the aircraft's center of gravity. The force of the ejection rocket kicking downward had pushed the nose of the jet down. Just a few degrees, but it was enough. The nose dropped, the wings bit into the air, the airflow reattached, the spin broke. Faust hung in his parachute, dangling in the sky, and watched in absolute disbelief as his airplane recovered from the spin all by itself. It leveled out, the engine, which was still running at idle power, pushed the jet forward. It began to fly. It flew smoothly, steadily, banking gently as if it were being flown by a ghost. "You've got to be kidding me," Faust might have muttered to himself. He was now a pedestrian in the sky, drifting helplessly toward a snowy mountain range, while his aircraft cruised away looking perfectly fine. The irony was heavy enough to crush him. He had fought the plane for thousands of feet, and the moment he left, it fixed itself. It was almost insulting. The F-106, now pilotless and free, descended gradually. It wasn't diving, it was gliding under power. It flew over miles of desolate farmland. It crossed fences and frozen creeks. It was a $20 million missile cruising through the Montana countryside with nobody at the wheel. Below, near the small town of Big Sandy, a local farmer was having a normal winter day. The fields were covered in snow, the world was quiet. Then a roar broke the silence. The farmer looked up to see a fighter jet coming in low. It looked like it was coming in for a landing, but there was no runway, just miles of cornfield covered in hard-packed snow and ice. The jet settled down. It didn't crash, it didn't explode. It touched down on its belly, sliding across the snow like a massive sled. The wings stayed level, the fuselage carved a groove through the ice. It slid for hundreds of yards, kicking up a rooster tail of snow before finally coming to a gentle stop. The silence returned. The jet sat there in the middle of the field. It looked intact. In fact, if you didn't know better, you would think it had been parked there. But there was one problem. The engine was still running. The jet thrust was pushing the aircraft against the friction of the snow. The heat from the exhaust began to melt the ice around the tail. The radar and the nose cone was still sweeping back and forth, searching for enemy bombers that weren't there. The local sheriff was the first on the scene. He had received calls about a plane crash, so he rushed out expecting carnage. Instead, he found a pristine fighter jet sitting in a cornfield, its engine whining, its systems alive. He approached it cautiously. He climbed up on the wing to look inside the cockpit, expecting to find an injured pilot. He looked in. The seat was empty. The cockpit was vacant. The sheriff was baffled. He scrambled back down and called the airbase. You can imagine the conversation. "Hi, this is the sheriff. I have one of your airplanes out here in a field. It's running. There's nobody in it. What do you want me to do?" The base command was equally confused. They knew Faust had ejected. They assumed the plane was a smoking hole in the ground. When they heard it was sitting in a field, idling, they had to scramble to figure out how to tell a sheriff how to shut down a supersonic nuclear-capable interceptor over the phone. Eventually, they realized it was too dangerous for him to touch anything. They told him to just let it run out of fuel. So, the sheriff and a gathering crowd of locals stood back and watched. The F-106 sat there for hours, the engine humming, the heat melting the snow until it eventually sputtered and died. Meanwhile, Gary Faust had drifted into the nearby Bear Paw Mountains. The landing was rough. The terrain was rugged and deep with snow. He was rescued by local residents on snowmobiles who had seen his parachute. He was cold, shaken, and convinced he had lost a multi-million-dollar government asset. When he was finally reunited with his squadron and told the news, he couldn't believe it. His plane hadn't crashed. It had landed. In fact, the landing was so gentle that the damage was minimal. The belly skin was scraped, and the wings had some minor structural issues from the slide, but the airframe was straight. The Air Force sent a recovery team. They took the wings off, put the fuselage on a flatbed truck, and drove it out of the cornfield. They repaired the damage. It wasn't just a museum piece. They fixed it to fly again. This specific F-106, tail number 580787, returned to active duty. It flew for years after the incident. Pilots in the squadron gave it a nickname, the Cornfield Bomber. It became a legend. Every pilot who flew it knew the story. They knew they were sitting in the cockpit of the plane that had landed itself. They joked that the computer was a better pilot than any human. Gary Faust continued his career, flying F-106s and later other aircraft. He became a respected pilot, but he would always be the guy who ejected from a perfectly good airplane. It's a story that humbles you. It reminds you that no matter how much you train, no matter how much you know about physics and aerodynamics, strange things happen. Sometimes the variables align in a way that defies logic. The Cornfield Bomber eventually retired. It didn't go to the scrapyard. It was too special for that. Today, it sits in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. You can go see it. It looks quiet now, resting in a hangar. But if you look closely, you can almost sense the personality of the machine. It's the survivor, the ghost plane. The story of the Cornfield Bomber is more than just a weird trivia fact. It's a window into the era of the Cold War, where the pressure was high, the machines were fast, and the line between disaster and miracle was incredibly thin. It's a story. It also tells us something about the nature of these aircraft. We think of them as inanimate objects, collections of metal and wire. But any pilot will tell you that a plane has a soul. It has quirks. It has a temperament. On that day in 1970, that F-106 decided it wasn't done flying. It decided it wasn't ready to die. It shook off its pilot, corrected its own mistake, and brought itself home. The physics of it are fascinating to analyze. The removal of the ejection seat changed the center of gravity just enough to lower the nose. The blast of the seat leaving the rails disrupted the vacuum of the spin. The trim settings, which Faust had likely set for landing or takeoff configuration during his struggle, were perfectly positioned for a glide once the spin was broken. It was a one-in-a-million confluence of events. If Faust had ejected a second later or a second earlier, the plane might have crashed. If the fuel load had been different, it might have exploded. If the field had been rocky instead of snowy, it might have been torn apart. But everything aligned. The snow acted as a lubricant and a cushion. The cornfield was flat. The engine was at the perfect throttle setting to maintain a glide but not gain too much speed. It was as if the universe conspired to save aircraft 580787. For Gary Faust, the incident was a mix of embarrassment and relief. No pilot wants to lose an aircraft, but to lose one and have it survive is a special kind of notoriety. It proved that he had done the right thing by ejecting. The plane was uncontrollable with him in it. His weight, his position, his inputs were actually part of the problem. By leaving, he saved the plane. It's a paradox. The recovery of the aircraft was a massive operation. The sight of a high-tech interceptor sitting amidst corn stalks became an iconic image in Air Force history. Photos from the scene show the sheriff standing next to the nose cone, looking small beside the massive jet. It highlights the contrast between the rural, quiet life of Montana and the high-tech, dangerous world of military aviation that happened just a few miles straight up. Decades later, the story still circulates in mess halls and hangars. It serves as a lesson to young cadets. Never give up, but also respect the machine. The machine might just be smarter than you. The F-106 Delta Dart was eventually phased out, replaced by the F-15 and F-16, but none of those newer, more advanced jets have a story quite like the Cornfield Bomber. Modern jets are unstable by design, controlled by computers. If a pilot ejects from an F-16, the computer might try to fly the plane, but without hydraulic pressure or electrical inputs, it usually ends in a crash. The F-106 was from a different time. It was analog. It was mechanical. It was built with a natural stability that, under the right chaotic circumstances, could assert itself. So, the next time you hear a plane flying overhead, think of Gary Faust. Think of him floating under his parachute, watching his ride drive off without him. Think of the sheriff standing in a freezing field, listening to the whine of a jet engine that refused to quit. And remember that sometimes the most incredible stories aren't about battles won or enemies defeated. Sometimes they're about a machine that simply wanted to live. The Cornfield Bomber stands as a silent testament to the unpredictability of flight. It reminds us that while we build these machines, we don't always fully control them. They operate in a realm where physics rules with an iron fist, and sometimes physics has a sense of humor. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please hit that like button and subscribe to Hidden Valor for more.